Hey, it's Jose Galison of No Way Jose. You can find me on the No Way Jose YouTube channel. You can also find me on the major podcatchers and on Odyssey as well. Today, my guest is Jeremy Kauffman. Once again, I'll keep reminding you guys that the way this works is right now, if you're watching this on the 21st at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, you are watching the live stream version. It will immediately after, I'll put it as unlisted, and then I will release as a numbered episode later. So my patrons will have access to the link, so they don't have to hunt it down because it'll be unlisted. So if you have the link, you can watch it later. But also my patrons will have the advantage of being able to do super chats or not super chats. I give them a little code ahead of time, and if I see it, I know to prioritize them in the chat. So it'll be almost as if they're super chatting. So that's a little thing they get for that. Like I said, I think I already said my guest today is Kauffman, and what we're going to be covering is we're doing another Anarchist Handbook episode, which I've been loving these. Trying to space them out a good amount so they're more of an event. We're going to be covering David Friedman today, which this is actually the first essay of Friedman's I've read, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised because I actually got it. He kind of gets a bad stigma from our ilk in certain circles, and I'm sure we'll cover that as well. As always, I like money. I brought up Patreon earlier, so patreon.com/NoWayJose2020 if you would like to be a patron. Also, go check out TopLobsta at TopLobsta.com. He has a lot of great merch. Also, you guys saw the new intro. This is the second time I played the intro. I didn't get hit for copyright, so I keep having to make little minor alterations or Justin Campbell, my guy, my dude. For any podcasters out there who need a guy, Justin Campbell. I can't remember his Twitter thing, but Justin Campbell, I think that might be his handle. Yeah, definitely go hit him up if you have any needs for that. But he's been kind of making little alterations till they finally stop dinging me for copyright, and I think I'm good. I think I finally made enough alterations to where they won't mess with me, or at least it's one instance where they haven't. So we'll see where that goes. If not, then we'll have to keep making alterations till they stop. With that, I'm gonna go ahead and bring in Jeremy, and we'll get to this. What's up, Jeremy?
Hey, it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm glad to have you back. I really enjoyed our episode before, and then also on Tower Power Hour. You are one of the only people within the LP that I think you're like in order of preferences. Like everyone knows I'm an agorist. The joke is I say like, as an agorist or whatever. But like in order of preferences, like within the LP route, you're like the top. Like whatever the fuck your tactic or strategy is, that's like the top of the LP strategies in my order of preferences.
And and as we're gonna hear tonight, I am an establishment shill. I like David Friedman. I like some consequentialist arguments. I'm even going to talk about how great Milton Friedman is tonight. So we're in for a blue-pilled regime episode here tonight.
Yeah, and I think I kind of agree with you. We'll get into that a little bit because I know Rothbard and Friedman kind of have their butting heads, and as more time goes on, I kind of more agree with the practical argument. Although there's merits to the moral argument as well, which is kind of where Rothbard's coming from, for sure. It's almost like different strokes, different folks. Who depends on how you're attacking the problem. But you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? I know you've been on my show before and on Tower Power Hour and been around, but I have a smaller show, so I always just act as if it's the first episode for every guest I have. So sure. You can introduce yourself to the audience. So.
Sure, I'll give my libertarian introduction. I live in New Hampshire as part of the Free State Project. I'm on the board of directors there, and I'm actually currently helping run that organization currently. I'm on the communications team for LPNH, Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, the most based Libertarian Party affiliate out there. Sorry, Connecticut and Kentucky, but you'll catch us eventually. Actually, you won't because you'll move here. I'm also in my entrepreneurial work. I'm pretty involved in libertarianism, but unless you want to get into that, we'll just keep it on the philosophical side.
Yeah, no, we don't have to go deep into that. I think most people know what you're most known for, which I know you try to separate those two worlds, so we won't go into that unless you want to.
Well, you should. I do. I'm involved in running Odyssey
there you go.
and the library. So if you want to mention, where your show could also be found on Odyssey,
Yeah. This is Entire Power Hour, so you don't have to worry about too much crudeness here being associated with that brand. So.
No, I'm not. I'm honestly, I'm completely comfortable with the crudeness. I just I want to avoid conflating, political things with my work, because my political things, they're my, that's a I will all right, I'll give a minor rant, which is like, I see libertarianism as like, it's my preference. I don't see it as like objectively correct. I could make arguments for this. I can try to argue why you should be a libertarian, but like, what I'm most firmly about, it's almost like a Descartesian kind of like, I know I want this, so I know this is true. Like, I know that I want libertarianism, and to me, that's sufficient. I don't need I don't need libertarianism to be correct for you. All I need is, I want it. Other people want it. We deserve it, right? Like, and that argument works for communism, by the way. Communists deserve to have communism. I think they'll be unhappy with the results, but people would say that to us, right? People would say, "Oh, you libertarians, you fools, you will be unhappy if you get what you want." And so, to me, libertarianism, it's my preference. I'll try to persuade you if you're interested, but if you want democratic socialism, you deserve to get it good and hard, is my opinion. So
yeah, no, I am same exact way. I mean, I feel like that's a kind of one of those things. As you get further down this path, you stop being this like. I know people always just say like, if anyone's not free, then no one's free, or whatever the hell the saying is.
I hate that phrase. I hate it,
because it's like, no, that's completely wrong. Like, I can be free and that other person cannot be free, and especially if you're in a situation where it's like, I completely laid out like how you could be free as well, and you don't. It's kind of like, well, okay. So yeah, but. So let's go ahead and get into who is Friedman. So if you want to lay out who he is for people who don't know him, super chat, Machinery of Freedom. Yes, that's the excerpt we will be covering today.
So David Friedman is the author of Machinery of Freedom. David Friedman is like prolific. So there's a lot of ways to get into David Friedman, but from the libertarian side, Machinery of Freedom is probably the best way. It's a free book. He's done multiple editions. Dave Friedman, he's absolutely brilliant. I don't think I'm a moron. I think I'm pretty smart, actually. But I interact with Dave, and I'm like, okay, it's like they're guys who are good, solid notch above me, right? It's a good reminder. I think he's absolutely brilliant, and he's brilliant, but he's a humble guy. It's one of the reasons I have a lot of respect for him. I have a lot of respect for people who are simultaneously, putting interesting ideas out there, putting interesting thoughts out there, but he's willing to admit that he's wrong. He tries to see the other side. So intellectually and the way he conducts himself, he's someone who I have a lot of respect for. I aspire to be as good as he is at that kind of thing. He has degrees in physics, but he did economics. He's a legal scholar. He has a great book, Legal Systems Very Different Than Ours, which is just this review of all of the different ways that society has been organized throughout history. He is the son of Milton Friedman, as well as the father of Patry Friedman. And Patry's very involved in the seasteading movement. The Seasteading Institute was his creation. I think he's moved on from that, and he's now doing something else, but he's still central to seasteading and this idea of private cities. Actually, I think he's moved on from seasteading to just private cities. So they're really it's three generations of libertarians. David, I said David was blue-pilled. He's really not. The video I shared earlier today, he calls his father jokingly and completely tongue-in-cheek a socialist because Milton Friedman was essentially a minarchist. And David Friedman says he's a full-on anarcho-capitalist. He says that we can have private government, private provisioning of everything. And so to want government courts is socialism, of course. I think where David differs from a lot of other right anarchists or anarcho-capitalists or whatever you want to call them, or just libertarians, a lot of libertarians in general, actually, not even just anarchists, even from minarchists, is David is fairly consequentialist. And so that is, he thinks that libertarianism is correct because it produces better consequences. He is less of a sort of natural rights or deontologist approach where he's saying like, libertarianism is correct because of the NAP and, these things are just wrong, full stop, regardless of consequences. That's less his approach. And I think both he and Milton do get some flack from other libertarians for that. But I'm here to give the defense or to talk about it. And I do really, David is not, I realize I joked in the intro, but I shouldn't have done that maybe because people are unfamiliar. David is not really in that regime libertarian camp. If you engage with his work, that's really not a fair way to describe him. So I do encourage people to really check out the source material. But that's an intro to David.
Okay, cool. So let's go into what he means to you and why, because you legit, when I put out a post, looking for people, you volunteered yourself immediately for Friedman. So like you kind of jumped at it. So it's kind of like, obviously it means something to you. I believe we talked previously and you said he was very instrumental in your path along the way. So I just kind of want to hear on that a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, both David and his father were, honestly. It makes me a little bit nervous because I have such respect for David Friedman that to be here kind of discussing his ideas and his thoughts, like it actually makes me a little bit nervous because I hope he doesn't hear it. I don't want to like butcher it or whatever. But in terms of my personal journey to libertarianism, sort of one of the early, maybe the first, or certainly one of the first sort of serious intellectual works was Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, right? And I was coming from a leftist background where capitalism was borderline demonized. Milton Friedman, in terms of I was fairly young. I was maybe 18, 19, 20, around that age. But like around my circle, like Milton Friedman was not, if someone knew who he was, it was not going to be a positive reaction to that name. But I was always a curious person. And I've read, especially in my youth, I would read books from all different sides. And I said, well, all right, I got to check this guy out. So I read Capitalism and Freedom. I found the ideas very persuasive. Now, Capitalism and Freedom and like the critiques of Milton as being, this sort of regime libertarian, I think are much more fair than they are of David. I don't think regime libertarians even deserve some of the criticism that they get. Like, I think Milton Friedman had a positive influence on America, not a negative one. I think if you watch the content from Free to Choose, it holds up very well. He certainly made some mistakes, but you're not going to find many libertarians who ever achieved remotely the influence that Milton did. And the nature of influence is that when you make mistakes, they have more impact, right? And so Milton, I think, gets blamed because he was one of the most influential libertarians to really ever have the amount of power that he had, the amount of influence that he had. But I think, so anyway, I read him, and sort of later down the line, a couple of years later, I read David, and I started reading David's blog, and he still blogs. You can find it. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but certainly David Friedman blog is gonna turn it up. And he still does. He puts out great content. He's on Facebook. You can friend him on Facebook. And he just makes these posts, and he's remarkably insightful about everything, from COVID to the environment to economics. He's just one of those people where you're like, that's a really interesting idea. And I haven't seen someone else say it. He's not repackaging things that other people say. He's genuinely coming up with his own insights. And there's very few people who do it so regularly as he does, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It makes sense that they are so at odds. I guess I don't even really know if they were necessarily so at odds. Like, that might be putting it wrong, but that we have these two people, Friedman and Rothbard, and they're both like polymaths. They're both geniuses. They're just ridiculous. Like, to the level of, you're like, it's just insane the amount of hobbies and different shit they do. You're just like, it boggles the mind. You're like, who the fuck does this? But I mean, it's impressive for sure. I did want to touch on it real quick. A lot of people were like, when I was saying I was doing this, like, oh, you need to get Friedman. And I would like to have Friedman on at some point. But for the aesthetic I was going for and the feel, and also just felt like that was like the obvious choice, I wanted to, I mean, once you jumped, it was kind of the perfect one, because it is also like, I want to kind of filter this more for the everyman. So like someone who's more, I guess you're like more new and hip, and then you're also going to be able to filter some of his autism through a more, I guess you got a little bit more autistic too, but a different type of autism. Yeah. So I mean, and I definitely would like to do one a little more deep in theory, but the idea is, like, I joke that I'm a retard who reads books, who, tells it to other retards or whatever. So that's kind of the vibe I was going for with my Anarchist Handbook thing, because I know a lot of people aren't going to read this shit. So so I'm kind of filtering it for them.
Yeah, I'm happy to be that middle part of the human centipede that is digesting.
Yeah, it goes from Friedman to you to me. Like it's like the sense of autism.
Yeah. So look, well, I will say, like, you don't have to. Hey, you're not going to buy the book? Fine, don't buy the book. Go friend him on Facebook. If you still have a blog feed, put him in your blog feed. He's not on Twitter, unfortunately, but he posts to Facebook multiple times a month, and he posts he's the kind of guy who's like, well, I read the 1,000-page IPCC climate report, and here are some of the questions I have. But it's like a compact post. It's not like some like really long diatribe. He's funny. He understands how to be, a little bit of a troll. He understands how to provoke. That's why I find it so funny that he calls his dad a socialist. I mean, it's just so funny calling Milton Friedman. So I don't know. I get a big kick out of it.
Yeah.
And he obviously knows that his dad wasn't a socialist. But he really does have a sense of humor about him, and he's a very human guy. I went out, so I was in the Bay Area, and I happened to be going out there for work. And David's also part of the sort of rationalist scene, effective altruism, Slate Star Codex, all of this, these various places. And he just had a meetup at his house, and I happened to overlap when I was there. So I went out, and he just had 60 people at his house. He cooked food for them. I mean, he's just a really nice guy, and he's a very human kind of guy. He's definitely a little bit on the spectrum. I don't know. Maybe all these brilliant people are, because he's just brilliant. He's just so brilliant. And but he's also he's very nice. He comes out to Pork Fest. He doesn't ask for anything. And he just likes talking and having conversations and sharing his ideas. And so I think, even if someone disagrees with David, it's tough to have a kind of interpersonal interaction with him and not come away with liking him, in my opinion.
Yeah, that has definitely been. The more I see him, the more he is kind of endearing. So it's kind of funny the shit he gets, which we'll go into that next. You want to address what's up, Top? Jose and Jeremy doing the Lord's work. I appreciate that.
Hey, brother.
You are definitely you actually have a skill, unlike me. So you keep it up too, Top.
Yeah. But I will say Milton gets way more shit than David, right? Like David's actually not known enough to get as much. Milton was really, of course, he gets withholding and all this stuff he gets blamed for. David, I don't know. Does David get crap from people? Maybe he does. I don't see.
He does within our circles, like the deep circles, because everyone knows the hate the state thing. So. Yeah,
well, why don't we just do that? Let's talk through the hate.
That's what I'm segueing to, or trying to, but you did it for me. There we go. Sorry. I don't care. Segue. Here we go.
I'm not a professional. I'm an amateur.
Neither am I. So, I guess technically. But yeah, no, I want to get into the hate the state thing because he is very consequential, and I don't know a ton of the history behind all this. I've read the hate the state essay. I know he kind of gets flack for it, and I read the Machinery of Freedom, this excerpt, and I can totally get where people come from that he's straight up just consequentialist. And he even in this excerpt from the Machinery of Freedom, he straight up does say at one point that, like when he's talking about national defense, like, if we get to a point to where it's not reasonable to roll it back more, then whatever, we'll hold off until we can we'll either stay there or until, technology down the line allows for, or whatever. So he basically is essentially like, if we have to be minarchists for practical reasons, whatever. And I'm kind of like, in a sense, I 100% agree. Right. Because it's like, if you were like, it's kind of like, I don't know, say you had someone who banged your girlfriend years ago and you absolutely hate them to death, and you're laying there bleeding out, dying, and they're like, and you hate their guts, and they're the worst person in the world, they're an absolute piece of shit, and they're like, hey man, you need me to take you to the hospital? And you're like, no, fuck you.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah.
I don't get it.
So this is one of David's very, very insightful points, which is like, no one, even if you're a natural rights or a NAP oriented libertarian, absolutely no one is an absolutist about it. Okay. If you fall out of a balcony window and catch someone's flagpole and the property holder says, let go, you're not going to let go, right? You're going to hold on to the flagpole. And there's a bunch of examples like this. You're you're going to freeze to death in the middle of the woods? Do you break into a cabin? Of course you do. A mass shooting is happening or about to happen, and your friend says, absolutely, under no circumstances, you are not allowed to grab my weapon and stop that person. Do you grab the weapon? Again, I would grab the weapon, right? And I'm less of a consequentialist than I think even David is, but David's point here is that like no one is, it's all a continuum. Everyone breaks down in terms of their quote principles for consequences at a certain point. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a very important thing to remember, that like the NAP is not this end all be all and it answers everything. And of course, the other problem with the NAP is people, it's not clear what is or is not aggression. Some people would take the stance that, going around without a mask on during a pandemic is aggression because you're increasing the risk of spreading a harmful disease to them, right? So even this idea that somehow the NAP is an answer for libertarians as to what one can and cannot do, and we can just follow the NAP. I think it's very clear that's false. I think Friedman has a lot of content on this that makes it relatively clear that it's false. So from here, we can talk about the national defense thing. And again, I would agree completely. And Friedman puts it in some way that's like, well, would you rather pay? So by the way, Friedman is an anarcho-capitalist. He wants to solve these problems. He's not a minarchist. He wants to solve the problems of national defense and everything through voluntary means. But he also accepts the conclusion, which I would, and it sounds like you would, that, if the question is, would I rather pay a 2% tax for national defense or a 20% tax to China after they conquer the country, although I think he uses Russia in his example because the book was in a different era, I would rather pay the 2% tax to America. Like, at the end of the day, we are libertarians because we think it will make the world a better place. Because we think there'll be more progress, because we think people will be better off. If it turned out that libertarianism resulted in a dystopia, where there's like 5 people who own all the property and everyone else is a serf, I wouldn't be a libertarian anymore. I don't think it plays out that way. And similarly, by the way, just in terms of being open-minded, if communism turned out to be this beautiful place, where everyone was taken care of, and we continued to make progress and innovate and all these things, maybe I'd become a communist. I think it's extremely unlikely that communism plays out the way. I think libertarianism is way more likely to play out in a positive fashion. But the point is, we don't hold our principles in a vacuum. We ultimately say, how do these principles play out? What do they produce? And if they produce certain things, we would reconsider, at least I would reconsider my principles.
Yeah, I definitely would too. I've said many times, I'm definitely more of an egoist, which I know a lot of people associate egoists with communists, but kind of plays to your point you were getting at earlier, where egoists, the whole idea is that like it essentially starts from the individual and works its way out. So it's kind of very Ayn Randian and like the virtue of selfishness or whatever. Yeah. And like for me, that's why like for egoists, it's like they can be anything. Like basically, it's just a matter of like what you think makes the most sense. And for me, anarcho-capitalism is what, if we play it out from an individual level, it's like what's best for me is what's best for, I feel like if I can behave in that manner and encourage others to behave in that manner, that's what leads to the most prosperous society that's better for my family, which of course I have vested interest in and so on and so forth. And it's very this big brain thing of like, well, this is what I think works out best. And a lot of people will go with like consequentialist arguments. So they're like, oh, well, you could just be like, well, then you could justify anything. I'm like, yeah, sort of, but to some extent, you can do the same thing with a moral argument, but it's kind of this point of like, okay, sure. Yeah, I guess you technically could, but you could also be wrong. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, it almost comes off this like hate the state thing to me. The more I think about it, it comes off as immaturity, to where it's like this, like, oh, I hate the state. And, it's this moral argument, but it's even to my own detriment. Like, why?
Yeah. Right. And this is, I don't want to, and I do think this is where Friedman differs. And I used to hold a more Friedman position as I interact with the government more. I truthfully, I moved away from it. But I think Friedman does regard most people, including most government officials, as like well-intentioned people, who want these same outcomes in terms of prosperity and human flourishing, but they're misguided in terms of how to achieve it, whereas Rothbard would regard them as evil or or wrong, and that I would say is the difference. By the way, I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I don't know the dispute between them that well. I've mostly consumed their work independently, but I think even Rothbard and Friedman, I don't think they hated each other. I don't think they had an act. Did they? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about this today while I was working that I can totally see both of their positions being rectifiable together, because it's like his idea is, do you hate the state? You can also hate the state and have because I hate the state, but I also am coming from a consequentialist perspective of but I can hate something and also grit my teeth if it's somehow advantageous to me. You know what I mean? I'm not gonna do it to my own detriment.
Yeah, I mean, and what I will say, one of the things that one of my biggest complaints about libertarians is this drawing of lines in the sand, and this the infighting and all this stuff. Because I bet at the end of the day, Friedman and Rothbard, they agree on 98% of things, 99% of things. There are very few differences between them, and even among libertarians, certain maybe these people, and maybe I'm one of them, like to drag reason or drag Cato or whatever. And certainly when I think when they say that some of the crazy things that they say, I'm not saying they don't deserve it, but at the same time, we need to remember that these people are 95+% aligned with us. They are closer to us than the vast majority of people. And for a group of people that are not winning, and libertarians are not winning, maybe in New Hampshire they're winning, but libertarians are not winning. We can't be excluding people. We got to find all the allies that we can. We don't have the privilege of doing this kind of thing. And so I do, I'm not opposed to disagreeing with people or saying when someone else is wrong. Even someone like people who have came at me, like an Andy Craig or some of these Cato types, it's I'd still work with those people in a second. I don't hate those people. I think they're foolish sometimes, but I still recognize that they're more similar to me than almost anyone else.
Mm-hmm. Real quick, thanks for the super chat, Jermaine. All right, let's start wheeling into the actual excerpt itself. I think we're totally in agreement, it sounds like, on the whole hate the state thing. I know he did call out, not to go back into it, but I know Rothbard did call out Friedman specifically in there, but so maybe there is some sort of contention there. I mean, I would actually, in retrospect, think that he was kind of wrong, because I'm not a fan of the moral argument. I like the moral argument for, as condescending as it may sound, I like using moral arguments to kind of cut through bullshit, because it's if I'm talking to someone, it's a lot easier to make a moral argument than it is to sit there and explain to them well, you got to understand that there's Austrian economics, and if this happens, then that happens, and blah, blah, blah. It's a lot easier to just be well, that's bad. You're not supposed to do that because of morals. So, sorry, you were going to say something?
No, go ahead. I mean, I think we started to touch on, in terms of the excerpt from the handbook itself, and I think it's a fine excerpt, and it was good to include in the book. I mean, to me, Friedman, this excerpt is I don't even know that it's 1/10 of what's interesting about Friedman, but we kind of touched on it, because the excerpt in the book, it basically focuses on national defense. Or public goods generally, how can a public good be produced in an anarcho-capitalist society or in a voluntary way? Should I talk about what a public good is?
Sure. I was going to start with the because he goes with the devolving of the state into or of the anarchism back into a state. I was gonna kind of go consequential, because I do have a lot of notes in the book. So.
Okay, let's do that one. Sorry, you're right. I forgot that was also in the book. This part about, does anarcho-capitalism just devolve back into a state?
Yeah. It very much, if you read this, it definitely is. It's all it is. It's completely just an autism breakdown of if this then that, and if this then that, and it goes into he kind of presents the argument of because the first thing he brings up is what would happen if we had anarchy. A lot of people, one of the critiques is that it will devolve back into a state, and he kind of breaks it down. For example, he talks about initially about how a lot of people say people will just bribe the police force, and it's he goes into well, that wouldn't make sense, because the police force would have this anarcho police force would have the vested interest in not doing that. So I mean, obviously individuals, but for example, like one good part, he goes, what about the possibility of the mafia getting its own agency? And he's talking about like insurance, like private anarcho-capitalist, like private insurance agencies type deal, which is like what a lot of people go to is the go-to for the ideal and magical Ancapistan. And he goes, in order for such a firm to provide its clients with the service they want, protection against the consequences of their own crimes, and he kind of goes into how, like, well, I mean, a lot of people go like, oh, what if the mafia gets into it? It's like, okay, well, then they're just doing, they're helping, you know, like, because then or no, he's talking about there about how they would protect people like criminals against the cost of their own crimes, and it's. I forgot my whole point there, but it is very just an autism stream in this, and like, if this and that. Sorry,
and
you're gonna say something.
I will say in terms of my personal preferences, like I like the theory. I find these like pure theoretical debates about, you know, ANCAP versus minarchy. It's like, okay, but they're both great. Like they're both way better than where we are. I think one point that Friedman makes here that's very good, and he makes this point repeatedly, not just in this case, but in many other cases where he talks about libertarianism, is that like it's a mistake to be comparing this proposal to the ideal in which there is no corruption and no crime, because that doesn't exist.
Yeah,
that doesn't exist today. And as a consequentialist, his question is, would this anarcho-capitalist design where you have competing rights organizations, would it be better or worse than what we have today? Because the mafia exists today. The mafia gets away with crimes today. It's not as if democracy in the way that it produces rights protection is some particularly great system. It makes mistakes all of the time. People are wrongly prosecuted all of the time. People get away with crimes all of the time. And so the first question that he would say is this going to be better or worse than the status quo? And it's not a question of whether it would be perfect or something like this. And I think this is a really, really good point, because so much of our current society is just so messed up. And so the question for libertarians or anarcho-capitalists is not, would your society be perfect and have no problems, but would it be better than what we have? Right. And I think the answer there is a resounding yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a common theme throughout, that he's not presenting any sort of utopia. He's literally just presenting like this is like I brought up with the cops and bribery. He goes, oh yeah, even in an anarcho-capitalist system there would be bribery, but it would be reduced because the incentives drive it this way and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And because as everyone like immediately, you know, has these assumptions, you know, like that the mafia is going to get into, you know, and they're going to eventually become the government all over again. But he's like, well, you know, the incentives would cause this. I want to read this real quick. He said, another and related argument against anarcho-capitalism, that the strongest agency will always win. The big fish will eat the little fish, and the justice you get will depend on the military strength of the agency you patronize. This is a fine description of governments, but rights enforcement agencies are not territorial sovereigns. One which settles its disputes on the battlefield is already lost, however many battles it wins. Which because battles are expensive, also dangerous for clients whose front yards get turned into free fire zones. The clients will find a less flamboyant protector. No clients means no money to pay the troops, which is fucking genius. Like the way he breaks it down, it was like I don't know. He's kind of I don't know if you have anything to say on that one, but
yeah. Look, I mean, I completely agree with him, and this is I think this is part of what he's so good at, is playing these things out and you know, recognizing what's the comparative choice. And it's also part of why I respect him so much, because he's not a demagogue. He doesn't make these grandiose promises. He doesn't say these things will never happen. He says they're disincentivized to happen. They'll happen seldomly, you know, this kind of thing. And that's a big part of why I have such respect for him.
Yeah. Michael Ravel, I appreciate the super chat. He says, appreciate this series. I believe it's supposed to be the N-word. I'm not going to say that because I'm a respectable individual. Keep it going. Appreciate it, man. I was being silly, obviously. This one's a little bit long, but I'm going to read it. I really love this. Because perhaps the best way to see why anarcho-capitalism would be so much more peaceful than our present system is by analogy. Consider our world as it would be if the cost of moving from one country to another were zero. Everyone lives in a house trailer and speaks the same language. One day, the president of France announces that because of troubles with neighboring countries, new military taxes are being levied and conscription will begin shortly. The next morning, he finds himself ruling a peaceful but empty landscape, the population having been reduced to himself, 3 generals, and 27 war correspondents. Which, once again, is just genius, because it is kind of pointing out the idea of having competing insurance agencies essentially being, I know a lot of people would compare them to governments, but that's kind of his point. It's like, sure, if you want to call them governments, okay, here's your analogy. If they're governments, they're like, this is the ideal version of government if we're going to have a quote unquote government, although most ANCAPs would not describe those as governments because they're completely voluntary. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, exit rights are the key to everything. They're the missing piece. They're why modern society is so screwed up, because there's not competition. Exiting is very challenging, and this is really what keeps the status quo, which is not just in the U.S., it's everywhere, right? You basically have the equivalent of an oligopoly. I mean, maybe this is jumping too much, but it made me think of David Friedman's, one of his favorite quotes of mine, which is that the ideal form of government is a competitive dictatorship like restaurants. So he says restaurants are a competitive dictatorship. And I think restaurants are pretty great, right? Like, I can go to lots of different places. I'm almost always satisfied. I get good customer service. I don't choose what's on the menu. I have no say in how the restaurant is run. I choose where I want to eat, right? And this results in very high quality service. And so Friedman would say that this same kind of property would be true if we had to hire the people who were protecting us and securing our rights.
Yeah. Here's another key insight that I thought was really interesting. He's talking on why he's kind of pointing out why it wouldn't be this frequent issue of, coups be happening. Like, he does admit that I guess it's technically a possibility, but he goes, once again, not being a utopian, because with these insurance agencies, he's like, kind of the point is like, why don't they just group together and have a coup and rule? He goes into, in our society, the men who must engineer such a coup are politicians, military officers, and policemen. Men selected precisely for the characteristic of desiring power and being good at using it. I'm going to go more into it here in a second, but I do want to point out, a lot of people know I just got out of the military, and I can tell you firsthand, the people who rise to the top are the people who have a proclivity for exerting power or having those sorts of behaviors. They're not the people who are the most efficient at their job whatsoever. I mean, they do try to incentivize within the military. They always kind of do this like limp-wristed attempt at fucking, being like, oh, well, this person's good at their job. But generally speaking, that's not what gets you promoted. So the people who end up towards the top are not the people who are like, oh, like I was a mechanic. They're generally not great mechanics who end up at the top. It's generally people who have a proclivity for power and a desire for power. And even though it is a silly position where it's like you don't have a ton of power, that's just the way humanity works. He goes, they are men who already believe that they have a right to push other men around. That is their job. They are particularly well qualified for the job of seizing power. Under anarcho-capitalism, the men in control of agencies are selected for the ability to run an efficient business and please their customers. It's always possible that some will turn out to be secret power freaks as well, but it's surely less likely that under a system where the corresponding jobs are labeled non-power freaks need not apply. Which, I mean, once again, a great insight. And it's one of those things you don't really think about. He really does, like, he clearly took the time to think through all these different little things, because I don't know, it is one of those things I don't think gets pointed out a lot like that. Like, the people who rise to the top in these agencies aren't going to be the same people who rise to the top in our current system.
Right. So, yeah. I mean, think about, the Uber. Yeah. I mean, maybe some people don't like this. It was, what's that British television show that does these dystopian things? It's on Netflix.
Oh, Black Mirror?
Yeah, Black Mirror. Black Mirror, right there. Yeah, right. I love that show too. I was just blanking. I haven't watched it in a while. There's that Black Mirror episode where like everyone's rated right after everything, right? And I can appreciate some aspects of that feel dystopian. But the truth is, if I look at things like eBay or Uber or these kinds of things, they do produce pretty quality service. It's rare that I get an Uber driver that sucks, right? And so if you have similar mechanisms for the people who are protecting your rights, like part of it right now is if you are this power hungry sociopath who gets off on the ability to hurt people and exert control over them, the mechanisms for keeping these people out of the police force are very weak. They're in a union. They don't suffer consequences of their action, nor does the department generally. Whereas if you give them these different incentives where, hey, if I hire cops that suck, I'm going to lose money, right? And you have that sort of business type ruthlessness in terms of the people operating the companies, like it makes a lot of sense to not hire bad cops, to not hire shitty cops. Whereas the current system, I'm not saying the current system is incentivized to hire shitty cops, but I think if you want to be a shitty cop, you can get hired, you can get away with it, and there's not a good mechanism for calling you.
Yeah. The next point I was going to bring up plays perfectly what you were just getting at. He's kind of talking about, how these different agencies would act. And he goes, this does not mean that they will never coerce anyone. And then, kind of ... In each case, coercion occurs, but it occurs by accident, and the coercer is liable for the consequences of his acts, which is like a lot of people don't realize, like say with like cops, like it boggles the mind for people to think of like how it would work a protection agency or whatever you call them. If you want to, for shorthand here, like we can call them cops, private cops, whatever. Like if they arrest someone or do whatever it is they got to do, if they arrest the wrong person in Capistan or wherever the hell, they are at fault. So, and it doesn't even like compute with most people's minds on this current paradigm how that would even work. And it's like, well, how that would work is they would be damn sure they have their man, because they're going to have to pay out money or something, or that guy could very well probably lose his job or have a demerit or whatever the hell. So it is, which I mean, it sounds dumb and silly, but when you say that to the normie, they go, what? Like, how would anything happen? Like,
yeah. Right. And then this is again where I think it's so important to compare it to the status quo, and where democracy is so ineffectual at producing changes or accountability in these kinds of things. I mean, look at the support, at least ostensible support, for ending qualified immunity last summer, where we had these people going into the streets who said our cops suck, and no one, I think maybe Colorado ended qualified immunity in like a limited way. It didn't happen anywhere. And the way that our cops are governed currently, it's like, okay, every couple of years you vote for a mayor, and that mayor, there's a whole portfolio of things that mayor is responsible for, where policing is a small one of them. The mayor can replace the police chief, like maybe. They don't actually have, hiring authority over these things. And of course you have police unions and all these things that are protected. And so it's like, how is that supposed to produce good cops? Right. And that's what we're comparing it to. Where Friedman would continue to emphasize is like, we're comparing it to the status quo of democracy and how democracy produces a policing system. We're not comparing it to whatever the people always want to compare it to, like this system where, oh, well, just good people go and become cops. Right. Mm-hmm. And it would be worse than that. And it's like, well, we don't have that system. There's not a mechanism for producing that system. This system is closer to that of just good people becoming cops than what we have currently.
Yeah, to play in the cop thing, such special rights allow government to kill its opponents and then apologize for the mistake. Like, that's just one line, but I just thought that was like so
yeah.
Like how do you expect them to be held to anything at all if they just go, oops, like, my bad.
Yeah.
Like, how often do we see cops get off? For example, I'll kind of bookend this section right here. This one's a little bit long. I'll kind of summarize the first part. He talks about how there was this raid in which 2 men were killed. The cops who did it were charged not with conspiracy to kill murder, but with obstruction of justice. And essentially, they weren't charged with killing someone. They were charged with lying about it, because the whole situation is they legit, I guess, like lied about the whole situation. They completely botched, killed the dude, killed a couple guys, and lied about it, and then they just got in trouble for lying. And that's not uncommon. Like I think he even pointed out in there, it's like it's not uncommon at all. Just to finish it off, this is not an isolated instance of the miscarriage of justice. It is a natural result of a system under which the government has certain special rights above and beyond the rights of ordinary individuals. Among them, the right not to be held responsible for its mistakes. When these rights are taken away, when the agent of government is reduced to the status of a private citizen and has the same rights and responsibilities as his neighbors, what remains is no longer a government. I think a lot of people don't take into account so much incentives and how they act. Like if you give this agency, this right to do a certain thing, it's going to eventually go to its reductio ad absurdum. It's just naturally the incentives are going to drive it that way. And yeah, I mean, I know initially, whenever you say 1776 or whatever the fuck, maybe it wasn't so bad, but over time it degrades. So
yeah. I reread the passage in the handbook in anticipation of this episode, and I caught that as well. That that's actually sort of Friedman's definition of a government. It's actually very similar to someone like a Michael Huemer, or I don't know. I think of Michael Huemer as like the next iteration of Spooner, although I don't know if you would agree with that label. But Friedman is basically saying that government is people with special rights, and so this idea that once police officers have to follow the same rules as private citizens in terms of accountability and what they can do, that makes them not a government, which is a definition I think I would agree with.
Oh yeah, for sure. I definitely would agree with that as well. All right, let's move into public goods, which naturally leads into the national defense, because that's kind of what a public good is. So we can kind of skim a little bit over the public good, but I don't know if you want to provide a definition of it.
Well, I do. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's unnecessary for the songs, but public good, I want to almost. I've tried to coin a rule, which is that anyone who refers to something as a public good doesn't know what one is, because you hear people talk about, education is a public good, or parks are a public good. And this is not what a public good is, right? A public good is a specific economic term, and it has to do with a good that people can't be excluded from receiving. Okay. So that is that if I want to build a private park, I can exclude you for not paying the membership fee. If I want to build a school, I can exclude you for not paying the price of attending it. If I want to defend the country, I can't exclude you from receiving that defense, right? So if I'm gonna defend you from foreign invasion, I can't just not defend. Everyone pays me but you. I can't exclude you. You're gonna get defended anyway. And these are some of the for libertarians, and particularly for anarcho-capitalists, the provision of this kind of good is basically the trickiest problem. How do you provide public goods in a voluntary way without coercion? And David Friedman, one of the things he says in this part of the book is this. He says national defense is the hardest problem for anarcho-capitalists. And from talking to David, I actually think that he's not 100% convinced that national defense could be done in an ANCAP way. He wants it to be doable in an ANCAP way. But if you said, David Friedman, what's the number one way that you think anarcho-capitalism might fail? He would probably say national defense.
Which I find funny, because I don't know, maybe I don't know why or how, but just for me that's not the case. I don't know if that's the case for you. I guess for me it's kind of like, well, I don't get why that'd be that much of an issue. I don't find it necessarily necessary to I don't know, because for one, I don't even think you need to have a national defense. It's like you look at places like Afghanistan or Vietnam, you kind of see the idea, the benefit of guerrilla warfare and not having an established and people will naturally, guerrilla groups will come together and work together for their common benefit. I mean, you don't need to, if you have this militia and that militia and this militia, I don't feel like you really necessarily need too much to get them to come together if someone's messing with them. I mean, that's the way I see it. I don't know if you disagree at all. I guess I kind of like to hear your thoughts, because I guess I don't get the sticking point at all. For me, it doesn't click. I don't know. I in my head, I can see a million ways why it wouldn't really be an issue. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm probably a bit ambivalent on it. And I mean, and in the case of David, I mean, the first edition of Machinery of Freedom was written in the 1970s, so a bit closer to World War II than we are now. We're 50 years, or pushing 50 years. I don't know when the exact year the first edition of Machinery of Freedom came out, but it was definitely during the 70s. So we're pushing 50 years away from that. and we haven't really seen that kind of major war. But we have seen wars that are resource based. If the United States possessed the same amount of economic prosperity that it has now and literally no defenses, it doesn't seem inconceivable to me that a foreign power would want to be involved or justify reasons to be involved. I agree with you at the same time. Like, it doesn't feel like it would happen immediately or that it's like absolutely necessary that it would happen. But honestly, if it wouldn't happen, that's kind of weird because conquest is human nature, so far as I can tell. It's happened throughout our history. And if we're resource rich and defenseless, those are the kinds of groups that have gotten attacked throughout history, right? So, I don't know. It certainly seems that like it makes sense to be thinking about it, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a fun thought process, but for me, I guess I don't understand it being a sticking point because I get what you're saying, but at the same time, if you have this large mass of land that's incredibly decentralized, there's no centralized thing for another agency to take over and be like, haha, this is mine. Like, I mean, maybe they can get isolated resources here and there, but you're playing a weird game and it's like Afghanistan times 100 essentially.
Well, but it doesn't have to be natural resources. It can. Well, but I think that's a natural way to think about it. But like, right? Imagine America has no defenses, and all of our corporations have no defenses, and like, I don't know. I'm not that like China really is the bad guy, but I'll continue to use China as the example. And China just sends, I don't know, 10,000 troops into Amazon headquarters and says, "Give us 2% of your profits." Right? It would be very profitable for China to do that kind of move. I guess we could expect every corporation to independently provide defense for itself, or something like this. And by the way, Friedman, I think, talks about this, that like one of the ways it could be provisioned is from larger corporations, wanting to spend that money to kind of protect their areas. Because I agree, like China's not going to come in and disrupt a small town. They're not. It doesn't make it. I agree that that's like not going to happen.
Yeah, and also I do, not to be a stickler or to cause a whole other hour discussion, but I genuinely don't think in Magical and Capistan we would have an Amazon or a Google or any sort of mega corporation like we do now. It would be far more. I'm not saying there wouldn't be large companies or whatever. I just think it would be. You'd have a far less of this dramatic like. Like it'd be more decentralized, even on a business level. It would be a lot harder for these huge businesses to rise to this level. So,
just sneezing there. I don't know how much this mic captures. I'm sympathetic to that. To me, one of the things, and I'm not trying to avoid the thought experiments. I find them interesting. One of the things I've seen as an entrepreneur is that what happens in real life frequently doesn't match my imagination. Mm-hmm. And so when I apply that mentality to this, I'm like, I don't know, who knows? Yeah. Like I do think, right, corporations get a bunch of protections from the government that allow them to be as big as they are, both from, starting with just the liability shield to IP to regulations that effectively make it more efficient to be larger because regulatory compliance is like a fixed cost. So you save if you're larger. At the same time, it's like, well, it does kind of, but I don't know. It's so difficult to play it out. Like, it does make sense to me, just thinking about it for like all 3 seconds, that some entity would attempt to become the most efficient, would be this really hyper efficient logistical distributor of goods like Amazon is. But I don't know, maybe that's not true. Maybe it would be this network of, 100 different providers with thousands of different, I don't know.
Yeah. Frank, I see you in the chat asking questions because you kind of jumped in late. This is an excerpt from Machinery of Freedom. It's specifically the part on mostly on national defense, and then the argument of why Capistan wouldn't devolve into back into a state necessarily.
Yeah. So I will, I guess, just a couple of, Friedman's ideas here, just to talk about them, about how these kinds of, let's assume that it is necessary for national defense. So Friedman talks about the fact that corporations and larger entities would have an incentive, that individuals would have an incentive, and that the value of providing it would be so much more than the cost that you could tolerate a lot of defection. There's this idea of Friedman, and this is we haven't talked about Friedman as a futurist yet, but one of the things that Friedman talks about is this idea of assurance contracts. An assurance contract is basically a Kickstarter, where you're saying, I will produce this thing if I get enough money. So that's one way of providing national defense. And of course, Friedman recognizes that there's incentive to defect. But assurance contracts have been innovated on. There's this concept of a dominant assurance contract, which Friedman is familiar with now, but wasn't a concept when he originally wrote the book, that could also help improve this. That's an idea of Alex Tabarrok's. Friedman also talks about the social nature. I mean, he's not this pure, he's not like this, homo homunculus, like, it's not rational. Like, he understands society. He understands the fact that, like, hey, if we have a culture where you're not regarded as a good person, if you don't pay your $200 a year national defense fee, that can be part of providing these things. So he does ultimately, he also talks about nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction, where that's actually not that expensive of a system to maintain and make possible. So he does ultimately think that it's possible to do these kinds of things in a voluntary way.
Yeah. Sal's in the chat. Just want to point that out. David Friedman, the medieval cook. That is a thing. That's one of his many hobbies, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's another way where, like, yeah, he's one of these guys who's so prolific. Yeah. He's big in the Society of Creative Anachronism. So these are the people who, like, they attempt to recreate old recipes and old ways of combat, and all of these antique ways of doing this. He did this when I was at his house. He made some recipe from, like, the 1700s in some, highly authentic way. And I don't even remember what it was, but I remember that he did take the time to do that. And that's what he is. He's one of these guys. He's like, oh, of course I've read 27 cookbooks that were written in the 16th and 17th century. You haven't, but of course he's not condescending either, but he's like that. He just consumes all of this information, and a very talented guy in that regard.
Yeah. All right, I want to kind of move on to, I won't go into some of the more obvious, like, ways of national defense, but I did want to go into, he did have some interesting insights that I thought were just kind of fun. For example, he goes, similarly, if national defense were financed voluntarily, people would give money not as a matter of charity, but because they felt that they were receiving something and ought to pay for it. So he goes into tipping, which I know sounds stupid, but you're like, people tip all the time. And if it's something that you literally have a vested interest in, and it's this, you would think in a anarchist society, you would have a social stigma of, hey, this is what's good. Like, this would be how society, this is the incentives that would be, in place. You'd be like, well, we like to be protected. So what is it to kick in a few bucks here or there, and, obviously those who can will, and those who can't won't, and, like, so on and so forth. So
right. I mean, there are all kinds of human systems that work because we feel that we ought to do it. To me, this is not from Friedman, although maybe it is. Maybe I've forgotten. I stole it from him. But traffic is a great example here, where, like, I'm guessing that you and most libertarians are not wholly selfish drivers who attempt to purely maximize the time that you get there and screw everyone else. If someone puts on their turn signal, you let them go. If someone needs to merge, you let them merge. We want to be social beings. We accept that, by being, pro-social, the system can work better as a whole. And so this is a reason for people to do it. This is another idea. This isn't from Friedman. I don't remember who I got this to, but you can even imagine something like stickers or decals or other social mechanisms. So unless you paid your national defense fee of $250 a year or $500 a year, you don't get the marking to put on your house that proves that you're one of those people. So there's the few people who would defect and not protect the country can be cleanly stigmatized and identified as bad actors.
Yeah. He also, I do like how he kind of went into in this about, like, he goes into, like, the Second Amendment and how militias came about. And he kind of goes into the benefits of an established, like, state, essentially, or or professional, you know, in capitalist, anarcho-capitalist type situation, military, because he kind of goes into how effective they are, but he goes into it's a double-edged sword. He says at one point in how, you know, if you have that, then also now you create this professional army in a government sense that will then kind of control the nation. But then he kind of uses that as a template to jump off of like, I guess, because the Second Amendment, you know, the militia aspect, he goes into like they pulled that idea from that. I forget. He used the example of who was it? The Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Oliver Cromwell. I guess he had a professional army at one point, which they were able to, you know, whatever endeavor they had, they were able to be successful. But then they end up kind of being a borderline dictator afterwards. So he goes into how that like when we came up with the Second Amendment, we were using that as a template. But he goes into how having a small professional army, but then having kind of like, you know, good old boys who are kind of your cannon fodder, if you will, who are kind of fill up the ranks. They kind of take on the less technical positions, so on and so forth, how that would work out well. And he kind of goes into that it's not necessarily going to be as expensive as you think, because of the fact that, you know, all you would need is have a small force of people that, you know, they could be the professionals that, like, in non-war times, they could be your firearm instructors or whatever, you know, like at the range and so on and so forth. But when the time comes, you know, hey, all right, cool, let's go. And you kind of get your good old boys militia together, you know, the non-paid guys, and, you know, they go protect they do their duty, you know, which would be their social duty in their eyes, you know, not like a government duty. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting way that he put that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before we go further.
Yeah, I mean, the point there, which I think is very good, is that like men in particular, they like being protectors. They like being able to show that they are, you know, tough and capable. You know, we have all these impulses, and it is this kind of thing that people are effectively willing to subsidize or be altruistic about. In the sense, and I don't mean that it's altruism in this, that it's purely altruistic, because there are these social benefits from providing it. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, look at how many people are volunteer firefighters and join the National Guard when it's not in necessarily their economic interest to do so. And this kind of thing, there is a civic benefit and a social benefit from providing these kinds of things and doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, and he makes his point further by bringing up paintball, which, I mean, you could bring up a million other examples, you know, mixed martial arts, you know, just general fitness, anything, stuff like that. That's stuff that people like to keep themselves in shape for similar reasons. Or, you know, you could even make an argument probably for, like, you know, first person shooters, whatever. Like, oh wow, like you're catching on to me. Yeah, he kind of brings in how paintball and how you could totally create a social stigma, not even a social stigma, where it's like a thing for fun, but there's this added benefit of like, hey, this helps. And I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be this thing you beat over your head with that people would have to, but people do it because they want to. I mean, like I said, first person shooters would be another good example of how you could do stuff like that. You could, I just thought that was a really good point that he brought up, because I don't know, the way he brought it up was a really interesting way to bring it up, you know, I don't know. I never really thought of it in that way before. I don't know if you had. So
no. I mean, he is the original. I mean, I did also read him, you know, sort of earlier in my trajectory than many other authors, but he certainly exposed me to that idea among many others.
Yeah, here's a little bit I thought it was cool. Is it a little poem or excerpt from something else he put in there? He goes, "We're a free people. We get up and slay the man who says we aren't. But it's a little detail we never mention. If we don't volunteer in some corps or another, as combatants if we're fit, as non-combatants if we ain't. Till we're 35, we don't vote, and we don't get poor relief, and the women don't love us." Which the last line is kind of, I mean, you know, it sounds stupid, but I mean, that's kind of what, you know, drives the world around. You know, pussy. I mean, if you're a dude out there, that is kind of what drives the world around. And if you want to, you know, have a family, stuff like that, there are going to be certain incentives that, like, if you are not someone who can be a protector, especially in this anarcho-capitalist type situation where it's like it's legitimately possible that you may need to be able to do that. In this society, it would be far more of a, you know, you need to do things more for yourself or your community than what we have now. There's no this like, oh, we'll just call the cops. I mean, I guess there would be, but it's going to be less of that.
I actually think reproductive success as a motivator and driver of sort of life satisfaction, or just why people do things. I actually think that's one of the things libertarians miss the most often in their kind of analysis as to whether people would be happier or less happy in this world versus another one. That's kind of an aside, not to your core point.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can we? I want to jump because we don't have that much more time.
We pretty much hit it all. I hit the last point thing. So.
I want to do one of this isn't in the excerpt, but I took this conversation to be David Friedman, sort of more generally than the excerpt. Maybe that wasn't what you want to do, but David Friedman on climate change. I think he is one of the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated, libertarian thinker out there. So if you're a libertarian wondering how should I think about climate change, read his blog posts. I'll attempt to talk about them a little bit now, but I think he's one of the best thinkers out there on climate change. That's a libertarian. And he's a nerd. He's super smart. He's a physicist. He reads all the IPCC reports. He reads all the papers, and he's not what some would call a denialist. So he doesn't say that climate change isn't real. He says that climate change is happening. Two of the points that he makes that I think are especially good for libertarians to recognize and be aware of. The first is that there's absolutely no reason to assume that the current climate is optimal for human life and human flourishing. And if you put humans first, which I do, I'm not. I don't think animals. I don't equate animals as take a lot of animals before we're talking about a human. At least for me, I think that's a very interesting point, right? Because we care about what's best for us as a human species if we're caring about this problem collectively. And there's absolutely no reason to think that any particular temperature. Did I lose you? Shit. You still there? No.
Yeah, I'm right there. My internet cut out for a minute. It's been
okay, it was you
lately.
My bad. I thought it was me. I started flipping out because occasionally it cuts out for me too.
Sorry. Go ahead. Let's
so I was just talking. To know. All right. So I lost it. Basically that there's no reason. So it's if you're thinking about it for humans, there's no reason. Now, so what you can then think about is what are the costs? So climate change will have negative costs. There are, if you're a libertarian with this externalities type thinking, it is potentially true that there is harm caused from your pollution. But David says, well, you don't know if the externalities of pollution are even negative or positive. They could be positive. I could be making society better by polluting. We don't even know the sign of the externality. It's clear that there's harms that happen, but there could be greater benefits. Right? There could be greater benefits because you're talking about most human beings are not in the bands of the planet that are harmed by climate change. If you look at how much territory is in Russia and Europe and even most of America benefits from climate change. You'll see some damage to coastal cities, but in terms of the productivity of America and Canada, where all of this land is, it actually gets better. That is that we'll have more productive farms and all of these things. And then he goes further and he says, even if it is negative, that's not sufficient. We need to compare what the costs are from adjusting for climate change to what the harms are, even if the harms are net negative, which we don't even know and are very challenging to prove. But if you look at the IPCC, all the IPCC reports, they estimate the damages. They do not have any positive side of the balance sheet. So they're not saying this is the benefit. This is the economic benefit that will come from having a warmer planet.
Yeah, that's an interesting point for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think all this stuff is really interesting. If you're a libertarian who is not sure how to think about climate change or wondering how to think about climate change, I mean, you could probably just do a Google search like climate change and his blog. He has a bunch of posts. He posts about it. I mean, he had a post on Facebook about it. Just recently, and this is just as a, not that this was like his best post, but just as an example of the kinds of insightful things that he talks about. He talks about this IPCC. I think it was like about drought, and so the latest IPCC report just came out, and they're looking at drought, and he's going, well, actually this analysis isn't correct because as the temperature gets warmer, plants need less water or something like this. And they didn't take this into account. And he knows this stuff really well. And he's constantly having good insights like this. Like he was really good on COVID too. And you might think, oh, this guy's the consequentialist libertarians, they were bad on COVID. No, he was really good on COVID, constantly having good insights about the actual cost benefit analysis of various decisions that you might, make. So I really encourage, following him directly.
Yeah, and there's obviously, on COVID, there's people like shit on the consequentialist argument, but it's like, well, maybe you're just not thinking deep enough because, say, with COVID, it's like, oh, well, people would scoff at a consequentialist and assume, they're falling to the narrative, but it's like, okay, how easy is it to point out, like, hey, there are consequences for creating a precedent in which they can behave or it's allowed, whether you agree with the science or whatever the fuck, like. I mean, whether COVID was, even from the beginning, we all thought COVID was awful. I was still like, this is a really bad idea. This isn't going to go well, whether it's bad or not. Cause, what about the next thing? But yeah, there's a really good point with the climate change. And I think we need to start shifting our thinking more. Cause a lot of times we're super binary, our kind, when it comes to shit like that. Like agorism is a good example of that. Like anytime the state overexerts, there becomes more of an opportunity to counter economy. This being the Odyssey dude, like the more the YouTube fucks around, the more that you find out, so you being a free stater as well, the same idea, the same thing applies. The more the state, it's like we need to stop looking, and we talked about it earlier about how like the idea of if a communist wants to be a communist, this idea of that we all need to be free or we need this national freedom is silly. Like it's really just like, no, we need to find pockets of freedom and move there. Just evaluate the current situation and react accordingly. Like right. I know everyone's like, oh my God, this is so bad. It's like, well, is it? Like I don't know. Have you thought about all the different opportunities that arise out of this? I don't know. So,
right. This is getting away from Friedman a little bit. So this is me, not him. But that's. It's about having a homeland. There's, we don't, even something like COVID, right? Like, all right, I don't know, like my position on COVID is basically like, do nothing. People should just be free and just keep living their lives. Okay. A lot of people don't want that, but who cares? There's enough of us that want it. Right. And it's like, we deserve a fucking homeland, man. Like there are millions of us with this beliefs. We have money, we have resources. Let's get a homeland for ourselves where we can live according to our values. This is my number one belief. And I hope that homeland can be built in accordance with principles that are similar to David Friedman's. That's certainly, my aim for that homeland. I hope we get to build it while David's still here with us, and maybe he can come and check it out and all of these things. But it's just like, I don't know. I hate all this stuff. I hate all the the fractionalization and this idea that we're going to win everywhere and we're going to, it's just so delusional to me at this point. And if we recognize that, hey, who cares about persuading people? There's millions of us that are already persuaded. We can have a homeland, in the next decade if we just get together and work together.
Ironically, that's the strongest form of persuasion, in my opinion, as well. So, go fucking do it. Like, create a praxis. All right, I know you had sent me some notes, and you had one more note, but I know you had a little bit of an out, so I don't know. That's up to you if you really wanted to hit on that note or not. It was on the Amish.
This one's really small, so it's a great one to close on because it's not a long debate. And I got to say this on Tim Pool recently when I was on there, and people loved it. And I'm like, I totally stole it from Friedman, and I didn't say it at the time. So at a minimum, this is a chance for me to own up that line that some people like. I totally stole from David Friedman. And David Friedman makes the point that the Amish are the most successful anarchist movement in America. The Amish are the most successful anarchists, and he says that they're the most successful anarchists because they don't pay Social Security, they don't have to register for the draft. Okay, And the Amish did that by,
Yeah.
it's quite similar to the Free State Project, to plug my suggestion a little bit. They were together in a physical space and they just said no. They just said, no, we're not going to do it. And they literally got carve-outs from the federal government. And so, people like to get so focused on like, let's role play secession and the government's going to come in and crush us. And it's like, okay, or if you just say no, the government won't do that. They'll just give you carve-outs. There's precedent for it. They do it all the time. Government regulation and government control is completely like sour grapes. Okay. They want to regulate you if they can. And if they can't, they never wanted to. Okay. Yeah. And so when you create a situation in which the government can't control you, they're going to act like they didn't want to control you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially too, if it's, because I've been saying a lot through a lot of stuff that I would prefer to see soft nullification or soft secession, because if you don't make a big formalized thing about it, then it's not this big formalized thing. If you're just like, no, we're not doing that shit, and you don't make a thing of it, like you don't have to throw a big middle finger up to the state. You can just not do it. And if you do that, then like if you like say with like people bring up the Civil War, it was like, well, this was a big, a big what's the word I'm looking for? A conflict between the two where they were at each other's throats. But now if the South had, I'm not gonna, I might be wrong, but say the South had gone about it a little bit differently, a little bit more like subtly, and just been like, well, we're just kind of not doing it, and we won't say, we're not going to make a formalized thing about it. We're just going to kind of do what we want. And then when you complain, you go, well, that's weird. I guess we weren't following your rules. Oh, that sucks. And just still keep doing it anyways. Then that would have been a different story instead of this whole formalized process. But we'll finish out because I know you want to get going, but I did want to point out, I find it awfully hilarious that you went on a show that had tens or hundreds of thousands of viewers and you made a statement and then you went to go correct it on one that'll get like 1,000.
Well, that's the best way to do it. No, that's perfect because I got the credit for saying it, but now I don't have the guilt. So it's really an ideal situation. Everyone thinks I said it, and I no longer have to carry around the guilt. So really, this is perfect. It's the best way to do it. So highly recommended technique.
Yeah, that's genius, really. You want to go ahead and drop your plugs? I feel like it's a good spot. I know you got to get out of here. So
follow Jose on Odyssey. That's my top plug. If you want to follow me, I'm the most active on Twitter. I'm at my full name, Jeremy Kauffman. Check out the Free State Project, Free State NH on Twitter, or they're everywhere. They're on Facebook. They have a website, fsp.org. I think that's the future of liberty. So if there's number one thing to check out, it's absolutely that. And you can follow me on Odyssey as well. My handle there is KAUFFJ.
All right, cool. I'm going to do my plugs right now, and I'll play an ad after, and you can feel free to bounce, or you can stick around and talk after. I know you have somewhere to go, so I mean, you don't have to worry about hurting my feelings. I know what's up. So, but I'm the No Way Jose. Oh, once again, I really appreciate you coming. This was a lot of fun. I was glad to have you on again. But this is the No Way Jose YouTube channel. You can find, or this is No Way Jose show. You can find me on YouTube. You also find me on every major audio podcatcher. I'm on Odyssey as well. My Twitter is @GallySonJose. If you'd like to support me at patreon.com/NoWayJose2020, that would be awesome. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. With that, it's been awesome. I really appreciate having you. I'm going to play the ad. You guys should definitely go check these guys out so I can get some money. And also they are people who've been supporting Liberty content creators and the like. So it's definitely a good person to support. So I appreciate it, Jeremy.
Thanks. It was great to be on.
Okay, thanks. If you love playing fantasy football but struggle to find the right resource to help with your research, the guys at Football Insider Edge have you covered. Whether you are a season-long player, focused on DraftKings or FanDuel contests, or just like to make the occasional wager each week on a couple of games, Football Insider Edge provides you with the research tools and in-depth analysis to take your game to the next level. With their proprietary model, matchup charts, and industry award-winning content, the team at Football Insider Edge have devoted themselves to educating their subscribers, helping them improve their play, and a few special moments winning life-changing money. They are proud of the community they've built through weekly interaction on their Slack chat channel and take great pride in helping others to achieve their goals of becoming better fantasy players. As supporters of the show and of the Liberty Movement as a whole, they are currently offering a 20% discount on any monthly or full season plan on their website. Just go to footballinsideredge.com and use the code Jose at checkout to take advantage of the discount offer today. So if you guys are fantasy football people, go check this out. It's a win-win-win. I win, you win, they win. There's no loss here. It's fucking capitalism, baby. Let's do it.